Okay, let's talk a little bit about Bitcoin history today. You may have seen this. HBO announced another documentary claiming to know who Satoshi is. This time the focus will be more on Len Sassaman, but I'll get into him a bit later on. But I want to use this opportunity and talk a bit about Bitcoin history and, first of all, how it evolved, the key players that are mostly being brought up to be Satoshi, why it doesn't really matter if we know who Satoshi is, and what the potential future would look like if we would find out who he is and what would change in the network. But first of all, a bit of a history lesson. We all know that the Bitcoin white paper was released on October 31st, 2008. Peer-to-peer cash electronic system. Satoshi laid out the vision, sent it to a list of cypherpunks, and inevitably, there wasn't a lot of traction. There were a few people who were interested. Most play it down to say this is a dumb idea. We already had eCash before, it didn't really work. We had stuff like eGold and all of these early projects in the 90s. But if you want to try it out, try it out. That's sort of the ethos of open source development. It quickly evolved into the Genesis block be in mind with a secret message by Satoshi, a headline by the Times, we'll insert here right now. And from there on out, it sort of evolved. Early adopters such as Hal Finney, Adam Back, who discovered it a bit later, about 2 years later, Nick Szabo, very popular names in the cryptography world from the 90s and 80s, started playing around with it. They were early adopters as well, developers, mostly tech people, who saw a potential future in it. But at this stage, the network obviously was quite small. So you didn't really have a huge impact. You didn't have the big mining sites, the wallets, and the adoption we have these days. As a matter of fact, you didn't even have the 12 or 24 words to back up your seed phrase. You still had the mnemonic phrase, which is a long-ass phrase with a different variation of numbers and letters. So there was a lot of stuff going on that made it hard to get into Bitcoin. Things changed a bit when we saw first traction in 2010 with the now famous Pizza Day, 22nd of May, where someone paid 10,000 Bitcoin for 2 pizza. And this was sort of the first monumental step in actually Bitcoin getting a fiat price, and it then started to trade. Exchanges evolved, exchanges were hacked, think about Mt. Gox, drama was there, Bitcoin pumped, Bitcoin dumped, and we've sort of seen the early movements of what we would now see as a grassroots movement, because that's what it was at the end of the day. Throughout the first couple of years, Satoshi actually stuck with the project. He was also very involved on the Bitcoin Talk forum, an online forum where a lot of these early adopters would exchange ideas. You would see Hal Finney talk about stuff like Bitcoin banks and why it makes sense as a reserve asset. By the way, I made a video about this. You can check it out below. I've linked it. Or you would also see other things popping up, like the ideas of, hey, what if we have scaling solutions? Does it actually make sense to have custodial services, non-custodial services? And as a matter of fact, the more Bitcoin grew, the more attention it always got. And obviously with this hidden founder who no one really knows and knows what he does or what he's like, it also started building a bit of a mysterious nature surrounding itself. Then the real big hornet's nest that hit Bitcoin was when WikiLeaks was cut off from its banking services and they shifted to Bitcoin as an alternative. Many people in the community welcomed this because, it's finally the time where we get on board. But Satoshi was actually not really much interested in it. He said he doesn't think it's a good idea and he would rather have the Bitcoin network grow slowly and being more robust than having such a lot of media attention. And at one point, Satoshi realized that he has different things to do, he wants to move on, and he left the project, in his own words, good hands. And from there on out, things evolved like the Bitcoin core team. It started developing, and the next big phase we saw in the Bitcoin adoption was when Silk Road happened, a famous marketplace, online marketplace that used Bitcoin as a means of payment for, let's say it, not everyday things. And from there on out, the network grew again. We started seeing more prominent figures coming on, like McAfee, the now famous suddenly also died guy who invented the first antivirus. He was always a proclaimer of using Bitcoin because it's the only form of money where there is no third party involved and you can actually control what to do. You don't need permission from banks or other institutions. This then evolved into more prominent figures coming on. We had the likes of Roger Ver, who then also left the network during the block size wars, who was pretty much active in the early days of onboarding businesses. This failed. He then formed Cash, Bitcoin Cash, that forked off. And I'll leave it to you if it succeeded or not, but all of these involvements led to Bitcoin just suddenly growing further and further. No one really questioned at this point who Satoshi is or if he should be involved, but the media for some reason had a keen interest, and in 2014 you had the first big documentary and scoop about a guy named Satoshi Nakamoto proclaiming that he is actually the founder of Bitcoin. This led to a rigorous battle for him and his family and friends of actually proving that he's not. He was then, let's call it, stalked by the media, and all of this inevitably ended up at saying it doesn't really matter who Satoshi is, the network just keeps doing what it does best anyway. Okay, we got that figured out. So now we're in the years between 2014 and 2018 where a lot of innovation is happening on Bitcoin. Scaling solutions are being built, the Lightning white paper drops, sidechains come up like liquid, and suddenly you see this shift of first business movers, let's call it, who tipped their toes into Bitcoin, and then suddenly also the whole ICO bubble in 2017, 2018 that then bust, Bitcoin dropped again, the media proclaimed it's dead again, and it's always this ride up and down, whether you look at it from a historical context or whether you look at it now from this new documentary context. And speaking of this documentary, the newest take is now that Len Sassaman, also a former cryptographer, unfortunately took his life but was also very early invested in Bitcoin, should be Satoshi. They're going to point out the evidence towards that, and at this point it's all again just pure speculation. But this gets me to the more important point. Is it actually important to know who Satoshi is? See, if I ask you now, do you know who invented the internet? You're probably not going to be naming all the names that were involved in the very early days at the UCLA project where they actually created the internet as we know it these days. Or it doesn't really matter if I ask you, do you know who the Ethernet cable invented? Because we just use these tools. The same way Bitcoin is now being used not only as a peer-to-peer cash electronic system in the global south, in remote areas, in areas who don't have access to banking, but also now, thanks to the ETFs, amongst institutional investors. There is no need to know who invented it. The only thing we need to know is if it actually works. Famously, it does. Bitcoin is the most robust network and hasn't been down in god many years, if not decades at this point. And furthermore, this risk of exposing the founder also goes against the pure nature that we see with Bitcoin. It doesn't matter who the third party is, or even the second party is you interact with if you send a Bitcoin transaction. All that matters is if you stick to the rules according to the network. And if Satoshi would suddenly reappear, it would also be very hard for him to actually change consensus in the network because that is being programmed in. In his own words, he said, it doesn't matter what my opinion is, or I don't have time to convince others of it. Either you understand how it works or you don't. And also, if you now go in like, oh, if Satoshi sells all his coins, aren't we doomed? Yeah, of course, we would be doomed for a short period of time where the price would fall, measured in fiat terms. But guess what happened in the last couple of years? Every time Bitcoin dumped, there were people at the low end who were willing to buy in because they see the potential Bitcoin has, they see the immense value it brings, and things would level out, just as it was intended in the white paper. So, are we going to watch the HBO series to find out what they're saying? Yeah, most probably, because we're interested in knowing what the claims are. Although, having seen the first couple of leaks, it doesn't seem to stick up, and I think it will end more in the situation we've seen in 2014 with the Newsweek doc. There is a really famous saying in Bitcoin that goes, we're all Satoshi, and this is something we should take up to our heart. Whether you're just saving in Bitcoin, whether you're contributing as a developer, or whether you're researching now to understand it better, the minute you start spending time and understanding all of these mechanisms and really understand that there's no single entity in the network that can have an influence, therefore it doesn't matter who it is, that's the moment you realize that you're part of a bigger game here. I hope maybe someone from HBO sees this video as well and realizes that it's not important. Nevertheless, I look forward to the documentary and to the claims, and I'm sure there will be a lot of debunking in the coming months and weeks. If you found this video helpful, leave us a comment below, give us a thumbs up or a like, and if you got questions or feedback to suggest what I should do next, also leave this there. And more importantly, I look forward to seeing you in the next one, maybe digging down a bit deeper in certain historic context of what happened in Bitcoin.